The night the Royal Navy bled. How one German battleship nearly broke Britain at sea. At 6:01 a.m. on May 24, 1941, HMS Hood, the pride of the Royal Navy, the most famous warship in Britain, the symbol of British sea power for 2 decades, exploded. The detonation was so violent that witnesses aboard HMS Prince of Wales, sailing just 1,000 yards astern, were momentarily blinded by the column of flame that shot hundreds of feet into the air. When their vision cleared seconds later, Hood was gone. Simply gone. Where moments before had been 42,000 tons of steel and armor, carrying 1,418 men, there was now only roiling water, burning oil, and scattered debris. 3 men survived. 3 out of 1,418. They'd been stationed on exposed deck positions when the explosion occurred, positions that should have been the most vulnerable during combat, but which paradoxically saved them when everything around them disintegrated. The rest of Hood's crew died instantly, or within the 3 minutes it took the shattered hull to sink. Most never knew what killed them. One moment they were fighting their ship in a battle they'd trained for. The next, they were dead. The shock rippled through Britain like a physical blow. Hood wasn't just another warship. She was the mighty Hood, the largest warship in the world when commissioned in 1920. The vessel that had toured the Empire during the 1920s, showing the flag and representing British power. She was supposed to be invincible, and she'd been destroyed in less than 10 minutes of combat by a German battleship that was only 3 days into its first operational cruise. The battleship that killed her was Bismarck, Germany's newest, most powerful warship, designed specifically to terrorize the Atlantic convoy routes that kept Britain alive. And as Hood sank into the Denmark Strait, Bismarck was steaming away virtually undamaged, heading toward the open Atlantic where hundreds of vulnerable merchant ships awaited. If she reached the convoy lanes, if she began the raiding campaign she'd been built for, the war at sea could shift in Germany's favor in ways that no amount of air power or submarine warfare could achieve. What followed was a hunt unlike any other in naval history. Every available British warship racing to intercept Bismarck before she could disappear into the Atlantic, before she could inflict damage Britain couldn't afford, before her escape could compound the disaster of Hood's loss. For 3 days, the Royal Navy pursued with something approaching desperation. Ships converged from across the Atlantic. Fuel tanks ran toward empty as captains pushed their vessels beyond prudent limits. Churchill himself followed the chase hour by hour, issuing direct orders. Sink the Bismarck. Because this wasn't just about revenge, though revenge certainly motivated the men who'd watched Hood die. This was about preventing a disaster that could fundamentally alter the Battle of the Atlantic. And for much of those 3 days, it looked like Bismarck would escape. The trap that almost worked. The Denmark Strait, between Iceland and Greenland, was supposed to be Britain's watchdog position, the place where German heavy ships trying to break out into the Atlantic would be detected and intercepted before they could reach the convoy routes. Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, commanding Hood and Prince of Wales, had positioned his force to block Bismarck's passage through this narrows. Holland's plan was tactically sound in theory, but fatally flawed in execution. He ordered his ships to approach the German force at an oblique angle that minimized the time they'd spend under fire before closing to effective range. Real quick, please like and subscribe to help our channel grow. Now back to the story. But this approach had a critical weakness. It meant Hood and Prince of Wales could only fire their forward guns, while Bismarck and her consort, the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, could fire full broadsides. Hood opened fire at 5:52 a.m. at a range of about 25,000 yards, nearly 14 miles. At this extreme distance, shells arced high into the air before plunging down toward their targets. This plunging trajectory was precisely what Hood's designers had feared. The battlecruiser's horizontal deck armor, the steel plates protecting her from shells falling from above, was notoriously thin, a compromise made to achieve her high speed. Her designers had assumed she'd fight at closer ranges, where shells would strike her thick vertical belt armor instead. For 6 minutes, the opposing forces exchanged fire as they closed at a combined speed of over 60 miles per hour. Prince of Wales scored 3 hits on Bismarck, one of which ruptured a fuel tank and contaminated other fuel stores with seawater. Damage that would later prove significant, but which at the moment seemed trivial. Bismarck and Prince Eugen together pounded Hood with their guns. Then, at 6 a.m., Bismarck fired her 5th salvo. One or more shells from this salvo penetrated Hood's deck armor somewhere near the mainmast, plunged through the interior of the ship, and detonated inside or near one of the aft magazines where hundreds of tons of explosive propellant for the main guns were stored. The explosion that followed was apocalyptic. The stored propellant, already primed and ready to fire, detonated in a chain reaction. The blast tore Hood in half, breaking her back between the mainmast and the aft funnel. The forward section rose momentarily, bow pointing skyward as the aft section disappeared beneath the surface. Then the forward section too slipped under, taking with it 1,415 men. The 3 survivors, ordinary signalman Ted Briggs, able seaman Bob Tilburn, and midshipman William Dundas, found themselves suddenly in the water, surrounded by burning oil and debris, having no clear memory of how they'd gotten there. Dundas would die of exposure before rescue arrived. Briggs and Tilburn would spend over an hour in the freezing water before being pulled aboard a destroyer. Aboard Prince of Wales, Captain John Leach faced an impossible decision. His ship had just emerged from the shipyard, some of her systems weren't fully functional, and civilian technicians were still aboard working on her guns. She'd taken damage from Bismarck's fire, including hits to her bridge that had killed or wounded nearly everyone there, except Leach himself. And Hood, the ship that was supposed to be invincible, had just been obliterated in minutes. Leach broke off the action and withdrew under smoke. It was the only rational decision given the circumstances, but it meant Bismarck was steaming toward the Atlantic, essentially unopposed. The hunt begins. In London, the news of Hood's loss hit with stunning force. Churchill received word while at Chequers and immediately began coordinating the response. The Admiralty sent out urgent orders to every naval force within range. Find Bismarck. Sink her. Nothing else mattered. Force H steamed north from Gibraltar. The aircraft carrier Ark Royal, the battlecruiser Renown, and the cruiser Sheffield. The battleship Rodney, escorting a troop convoy westbound to America, was detached and ordered to intercept. The battleship Ramillies left her convoy escort duties and turned toward the hunt. King George V, Admiral John Tovey's flagship, steamed to position herself between Bismarck and the French coast. Cruisers shadowed Bismarck, tracking her by radar while staying at a distance that kept them beyond range of her massive guns. But Bismarck had advantages. She was fast, capable of 30 knots, faster than most of the British battleships chasing her. Her fuel tanks, though damaged, still gave her considerable range. And the Atlantic is vast. If she could shake off the shadowing cruisers, even for a few hours, she could disappear. What the British didn't know was that Bismarck's captain, Ernst Lindemann, and the overall force commander, Admiral Günther Lütjens, were already debating their next move. The damage from Prince of Wales's shells had contaminated fuel supplies and caused a persistent oil leak that left a telltale slick on the ocean surface. Bismarck was still formidable, still capable of devastating any convoy she encountered. But she was hurt. The question was whether to continue the mission or seek repair. Lütjens made the decision. They would head for occupied France, specifically the port of Saint-Nazaire, where German-controlled facilities could repair the damage. It was a reasonable choice given the circumstances. But it meant Bismarck needed to cross over 1,000 miles of ocean, while the entire Royal Navy converged on her position. For a day and a half, the British shadowed Bismarck, tracking her by radar from just beyond visual range. But on the night of May the 24th to 25th, Bismarck executed a perfectly timed maneuver. Taking advantage of rain squalls and darkness, she turned sharply to port while her pursuers momentarily lost radar contact. When the British reacquired contact, they locked onto Prince Eugen instead, the cruiser having detached to confuse pursuers. By the time the British realized their error, Bismarck had disappeared. For over 30 hours, the Royal Navy had no idea where she was. Ships steamed in search patterns, trying to anticipate Bismarck's course. Was she heading for the convoy routes? Making for the Denmark Strait again? Attempting to reach France? Every hour of uncertainty was an hour Bismarck could use to reach safety, or to fall upon an undefended convoy. The break came from a mistake. Admiral Lütjens, believing he was still being tracked by British forces, sent a lengthy radio message to Germany describing the battle with Hood and detailing Bismarck's damage and intentions. The message was long enough that British direction-finding stations could get a fix on his position. The plotted position showed Bismarck heading southeast, toward France, not toward the convoy routes. But even with this knowledge, Bismarck was still too far ahead. King George V and Rodney were steaming to intercept, but their calculated intercept points kept shifting as updated position estimates came in. If Bismarck maintained her speed, she'd reach the range of German air cover from France before the British battleships could catch her. Once she had Luftwaffe cover, attacking her would become exponentially more dangerous. The Swordfish attack. The only chance lay with Ark Royal, the aircraft carrier racing north from Gibraltar as part of Force H. If her torpedo bombers could slow Bismarck down, even slightly, the pursuing battleships might catch up before she reached safety. On the afternoon of May 26th, Ark Royal launched her strike force. 15 Swordfish biplanes, each carrying a single 18-inch torpedo. The Swordfish was already obsolete by 1941 standards. A fabric-covered biplane that looked like it belonged in World War I, not World War II. Its maximum speed was barely 100 miles per hour. But it had advantages. It was rugged, reliable, and flew so slowly that faster ships had difficulty targeting it with their anti-aircraft fire because their systems were designed for faster targets. The attack nearly ended in disaster before it began. The first wave of Swordfish, flying in poor visibility, mistook the British cruiser Sheffield for Bismarck and attacked her. Fortunately, the magnetic detonators on their torpedoes malfunctioned. Most exploded prematurely or missed. Sheffield survived unscathed, and the chagrined air crews returned to Ark Royal to rearm with torpedoes using contact detonators. The second strike launched in deteriorating weather, storm conditions with low cloud cover, poor visibility, and high seas. The 15 Swordfish found Bismarck at around 9 p.m. on May 26th. What happened next changed everything. The Swordfish attacked in a coordinated assault from multiple directions, forcing Bismarck to divide her anti-aircraft fire. The battleship threw up intense flak. Her gunners fired everything they had at the slow, vulnerable biplanes droning toward them through the storm. Several Swordfish were hit. None were shot down. Their slow speed and fabric covering actually helped them survive, as high explosive shells often passed through their wings without detonating. The air crews pressed their attacks, dropping down to just 50 feet above the wavetops before releasing their torpedoes. In the rough seas and poor visibility, accurate aiming was nearly impossible. But one torpedo, perhaps two, found their mark. One struck Bismarck amidships, painful but not crippling. But another hit further aft, near the stern. This torpedo struck in the worst possible location. It jammed Bismarck's rudders hard to port, locked at a 12-degree angle. Damage control teams fought desperately to free the rudders. Divers went over the side in storm conditions to assess the damage. Engineering crews tried every possible workaround, using the propellers to steer, attempting to cut away damaged steering gear, even considering welding the rudders back to center. Nothing worked. Bismarck could only steam in a wide circle to port, or slowly forward while listing to port, heading inexorably back toward the British fleet she'd been trying to escape. Captain Lindemann knew what it meant. So did Admiral Lutyens. They radioed Germany. "Ship unmaneuverable. We will fight to the last shell. Long live the Führer." The final battle. The British forces converged through the night. King George V and Rodney steamed toward the crippled Bismarck while destroyers harassed her with torpedo attacks through the darkness. Attacks that inflicted no additional damage, but which prevented her crew from making repairs and left them exhausted. At first light on May 27th, Admiral Tovey aboard King George V made visual contact. Bismarck was still steaming in slow circles, unable to maneuver. But her main guns were still operational. She was trapped, but still deadly. Rodney opened fire at 8:47 a.m. from a range of about 25,000 yards. King George V joined in moments later. Bismarck returned fire, and her first salvo was accurate. Her shells straddled Rodney, landing just short and just over. It was a measure of how well-trained her gunnery crews were that, even after 2 days of pursuit, night attacks, and exhaustion, they could still shoot with precision. But precision wasn't enough. Bismarck was stationary relative to the British ships. Unable to maneuver, she could only absorb punishment. Within minutes, British shells began hitting her superstructure. Her fire control systems were damaged, then destroyed. Her forward turrets were knocked out. Her bridge was wrecked, killing most of the command staff. Yet she remained afloat, her engine still running, her crew still fighting. Tovey ordered his ships to close the range. At 10,000 yards, the British battleships were firing almost point blank. Shell after shell slammed into Bismarck's hull and superstructure. Her upper works were a mass of twisted steel and flame. Her remaining guns fell silent one by one as their crews were killed or their mechanisms destroyed. Yet she wouldn't sink. Her hull, protected by massive armor belts, resisted shell after shell. The British had been firing for over an hour and a half. Rodney and King George V were running low on ammunition. Tovey faced the possibility of having to withdraw, leaving Bismarck crippled but still afloat, because his ships were running out of shells and fuel. Finally, Tovey ordered the cruiser Dorsetshire to finish Bismarck with torpedoes. Dorsetshire closed to 3,000 yards and fired 2 torpedoes into Bismarck's starboard side. Both hit. Then Dorsetshire circled around and fired a 3rd torpedo into Bismarck's port side. At 10:39 a.m., Bismarck capsized and sank. She went down by the stern, rolling to port, her colors still flying. Of her crew of over 2,200 men, only 114 survived. And only because Dorsetshire and the destroyer Maori stopped to pick up survivors before a U-boat alarm caused them to abandon the rescue and flee. What it meant. The loss of Hood had shocked Britain to its core. But the destruction of Bismarck accomplished at tremendous cost in ships, fuel, ammunition, and effort, proved something equally important. The Royal Navy could still control the Atlantic. Barely. Desperately. But it could. Hitler never again risked his heavy surface ships in Atlantic operations. The sinking of Bismarck demonstrated that Britain would commit its entire fleet to hunt down any German raider that threatened the convoy routes. The risk was too great, the likely outcome too catastrophic. But the battle revealed how close the situation really was. Hood had been destroyed in minutes by a ship that was just beginning its first combat cruise. If Bismarck hadn't been slowed by that single lucky torpedo hit, if her rudders had remained functional, she would have reached French ports for repairs. Then what? Another breakout? Another hunt? How many times could Britain afford to mobilize its entire Atlantic fleet to chase down one ship? The 3 days of the Bismarck chase represented the Royal Navy at its utmost limit. Every major unit within range had been committed. If a second German raider had broken out simultaneously, there would have been nothing to stop it. Britain's margin was razor thin. Ted Briggs, one of the 3 survivors from Hood, lived until 2008. He spent the rest of his life honoring the memory of the 1,415 shipmates who died with his ship. He attended memorials, gave interviews, and never forgot the morning when the world's most famous warship simply ceased to exist. The wreck of HMS Hood lies in the Denmark Strait in 9,000 feet of water. The wreck of Bismarck lies 400 miles west of Brest, France, in 15,000 feet of water. Investigations of both wrecks have provided insights into how they were destroyed. But some questions remain unanswered. What's certain is that 3 days in May, 1941, represented the Royal Navy's narrowest escape. The moment when Britain's control of the Atlantic almost broke, and when the determined pursuit of one enemy ship became a matter of national survival. Thank you for watching and listening. We really appreciate it. Please consider subscribing, liking, and even sharing this video.